February 18, 2021. In a quiet, tense room in California, hundreds of people stare at screens, holding their breath. They are waiting for a message from a machine 127 million miles away. But the paradox, the impossible, agonizing truth, is that the message they are waiting for is ancient history. The light from Mars takes 11 minutes to cross the void. By the time they receive the signal that the landing has begun, the rover, Perseverance, will have already been on the surface for 4 minutes, either victorious or smashed into a billion pieces. The most advanced, expensive, and complex landing in human history will be performed entirely by an autonomous robot with no help from its creators. This is the 7 minutes of terror. In that room, the faces of engineers, men and women who have poured a decade of their lives into this single machine, are pale. They are not pilots. They are not even drivers. They are an audience, watching a play that finished minutes ago, waiting for the light from the stage to finally reach their eyes. Every calculation, every line of code, every welded joint, it is all being tested at once in total, terrifying silence. The story of those 7 minutes does not begin at Mars. It begins 203 days earlier, a 7-month journey, cocooned in a specialized cruise stage. The machine is asleep, a silent traveler crossing the dark. But now, as it screams toward the thin Martian atmosphere, the clock begins. The first command is one of separation. The cruise stage, its faithful companion, is severed. Explosive bolts fire. Springs push it away. It becomes debris. The rover is now alone, protected only by its aeroshell. This is entry interface. The vehicle is angled precisely, its 15-foot wide heat shield facing forward. It hits the outer wisp of the Martian atmosphere at over 12,000 miles per hour. The transition is not gentle. It is a physical collision. The vacuum of space gives way to a wall of thin air, and that air, compressed by speed, becomes a superheated plasma. A silent, cold journey transforms into a violent, screaming inferno. The temperature on the outside of the shield rockets to 2,370 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than lava. Inside, the rover, tucked away, is protected, unaware of the firestorm just inches from its chassis. This is the first trial. The shield must hold. It must absorb and deflect the catastrophic heat that is trying to vaporize a $2.7 billion laboratory. But to understand this terror, one must understand the prize. Why this risk? Why this impossible autonomous ballet? The mission was not just to get to Mars. It was to find the single most promising and most dangerous location on its surface, Jezero Crater, an ancient 28-mile-wide bowl that, for decades, was considered utterly unlandable. Billions of years ago, Jezero was not a cold, dusty pit. It was a place of water, a deep, calm lake fed by a winding, powerful river that breached the crater rim. That river carried sediment, fanning out into a perfect, sweeping delta. It was an environment, almost identical to those on Earth, where microbial life could have begun, thrived, and died. Perseverance is a fossil hunter. Its primary mission is astrobiology. To search those ancient, dry clay beds for the chemical, mineral, and perhaps even physical traces of that long-extinct life. It carries a sophisticated drill to bore into the rock and seal samples away. Samples that a future mission will, for the first time, return to Earth. But the very delta that makes Jezero a scientific paradise also makes it an engineering nightmare. The landscape is a minefield. It is littered with jagged cliffs from the ancient delta front, fields of boulders, deep sand traps that could swallow a rover whole, and steep slopes. It is a place you would never, ever choose to land unless you had no other choice. In the past, NASA's landing techniques were simpler, almost brutish. The small Sojourner, Spirit, and Opportunity rovers were pioneers. They were encased in a cocoon of giant bouncing airbags. They were effectively dropped onto the surface, tumbling and rolling blindly for up to a mile before coming to rest. A gamble, but one that worked for a flat, open plain. That approach was impossible for Perseverance. This was not a golf cart. This was a 1-ton, nuclear-powered science laboratory the size of a small SUV. At 2,260 pounds, it would have ripped through any airbag ever designed. It was too big, too heavy, and too precious to simply be thrown at the planet. The previous rover, Curiosity, had solved the weight problem in 2012. It pioneered a radical, counterintuitive, and seemingly insane solution, the sky crane. After the heat shield and parachute, a powered descent stage, a jetpack, would fire its rockets, hover 60 feet above the surface, and lower the rover to the ground on 3 nylon tethers. The sky crane was a spectacular success. It proved the concept worked. But even Curiosity, for all its genius, had a critical flaw. It was blind. Its landing system could only be programmed to avoid large-scale hazards identified from orbit years in advance. It had no way to react to a sudden cliff face or a field of sharp boulders that appeared directly beneath it during those final crucial seconds. Curiosity's landing ellipse, its zone of possible touchdown, was a flat, safe, but scientifically boring oval, 12 miles long to land in Jezero. Perseverance needed an ellipse a fraction of that size, tucked right against the cliffs. To do that, it couldn't be blind. It needed to see. This was the single greatest upgrade. The challenge that defined the mission. Engineers at JPL had to give the machine eyes and a brain smart enough to use them. They called it Terrain Relative Navigation, or TRN. It was, in essence, a fully autonomous co-pilot living inside the rover's computer. Its job was to wake up, look at the ground, and find a safe place to park. Here is how it worked. Long before launch, NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter had spent years meticulously mapping every square foot of the landing zone. It built a perfect, high-resolution atlas of every known hazard. This map, a database of safe zones, was loaded directly into Perseverance's memory before it ever left Earth. Then, during the final moments of descent, a special downward-facing camera, the lander vision system, would switch on. It would begin taking rapid-fire pictures of the ground rushing up to meet it, processing them in real time. This is the genius. The rover's computer would instantly compare those live images to the master hazard map stored in its memory. It wasn't looking for specific rocks, it was looking for patterns. By matching the live view to the orbital map, it could figure out exactly where it was, down to the meter. It was creating its own GPS on a world that has none. If this new brain realized the rover was on a trajectory for a dangerous cliff or a boulder field, it would instantly calculate the coordinates of the nearest pre-vetted safe spot. It would then command the sky crane's thrusters to divert. It would, in mid-air, change its own mind and fly to that new, safer target. This entire sequence, seeing, comparing, and deciding, and diverting, had to happen in less than a second. It was the most complex, autonomous landing ever devised, and it had never, ever been tried before. Back at 12,000 miles per hour, the aeroshell is now a man-made meteor. The plasma outside is so bright, it would blind any human observer. The friction is immense, and it is doing its job. The vehicle is slowing down, trading kinetic energy for heat. But this slowing process exerts a crushing force on the rover inside. The G-forces build, peaking at over 11 Gs. Perseverance, designed for the gentle one-third gravity of Mars, is now experiencing a force 11 times stronger than Earth's gravity. Its structure groans under the strain, a stress it will only feel for these few moments in its entire existence. This is not a simple, uncontrolled fall. The vehicle is actively flying. While it is still in the upper atmosphere, small thrusters on the back shell fire in precise, calculated bursts. These subtle pulses of gas intentionally unbalance the capsule, angling it, generating lift, just like an airplane wing. This is guided entry. The rover's autonomous brain is steering the capsule, adjusting its trajectory, bleeding off speed, and aiming it closer to the designated landing ellipse. It is fighting to stay on course, correcting for any unexpected pockets of thicker or thinner atmosphere, ensuring it arrives at the next critical checkpoint at the perfect altitude and speed. This phase, the inferno, lasts for about 90 seconds, but in that time, the heat shield has dissipated 99% of the vehicle's destructive energy. The capsule has slowed from 12,000 miles per hour to just under 1,000. It is a stunning victory of engineering. But at this speed, it would still impact the surface with the force of an airliner crash. The first stage is over, but the terror is far from gone. The vehicle is now at an altitude of about 7 miles, and it is time for the second stage. At precisely the right moment, the capsule's computer fires a mortar. A 110-pound steel projectile blasts away from the backshell, pulling with it a tightly packed bundle of nylon, Technora, and Kevlar. In less than 2 seconds, the parachute unfurls. It is 70 feet wide, the largest, strongest supersonic parachute ever built. It inflates with a bone-jarring crack, a sound that rips through the thin Martian air, catching a wind that doesn't exist just a few miles higher. The shock of this deployment is enormous. The parachute instantly yanks the vehicle, decelerating it violently. This is the new challenge. The parachute has to survive being deployed at nearly twice the speed of sound in an atmosphere 100 times thinner than Earth's. It is a test of material strength, a gamble that the carefully stitched scenes will hold against a 60,000-pound load. The engineers at JPL had watched, hearts in their throats, as test after test of this parachute design failed on Earth, shredding itself into confetti in high-altitude drops. They had to invent a new way to test it, a new way to build it. Now, 127 million miles from home, they would find out if they got it right. The parachute holds. The inferno of entry is replaced by a new, swaying, and rapid descent. The vehicle is now hanging beneath its gray canopy, slowing but still falling fast, and the mission's timeline is now accelerating. Just 20 seconds after the parachute deploys, the heat shield, its primary job complete, is jettisoned. Explosive bolts fire, and the scorched, glowing hot plate drops away, falling to the Martian desert below. This is a moment of profound revelation. For the first time, the rover's eyes are exposed to the Martian atmosphere. The Lander Vision System camera, nestled in the rover's belly, clicks on. Its lens is staring directly at the ground 5 miles below. At the same time, the landing radar, the rover's second sense, activates. It begins pinging the surface, sending out radio waves and listening for the echoes, constantly calculating its exact altitude and velocity. The brain is now fully awake. The rover is no longer just enduring the fall, it is analyzing it. The camera is taking picture after picture, seeing the landscape. The radar is measuring the descent. The inertial measurement unit is feeling the motion. And the computer is fusing all this data together, building a complete picture of its reality. It is asking itself 3 questions, over and over. Where am I? How fast am I going? And where am I pointing? This is the moment that terrain relative navigation was built for. The rover's computer is now comparing the images from its camera to the orbital map in its memory. It is looking for the patterns. It sees a crater rim, a cluster of rocks, the shadow of a cliff. It matches these features to the map, and it finds its position. Instantly it knows. It knows its exact latitude and longitude. And it has a problem. The parachute, as good as it is not a precision instrument. It is being pushed by winds. The rover's brain looks at its current trajectory and looks at the map. It projects its landing spot. The verdict is digital, cold, and immediate. Danger. The parachute is steering it directly toward the Saital region, a hazardous field of rippling sand dunes and jagged rocks that the science team had explicitly forbidden. A place it would be unable to drive in, let alone land on. At JPL, 11 minutes in the future, the control room is still blind. They are listening to simple tones, beeps that tell them the parachute deployed. They are cheering. They have no idea their rover is, at that very second, flying toward its own destruction. They cannot help. They cannot intervene. The machine must save itself. Perseverance does not panic. It has its orders. It knows where it is, and it knows where it should be. The TRN system scans the hazard map and identifies the nearest pre-approved safe target, a flat, boring patch of ground just on the edge of the danger zone. It calculates the new flight path. It locks in the coordinates, and it waits. The vehicle is still falling, now at 200 miles per hour, still too fast. The parachute has done all it can. It is now a liability. The rover is 1 mile above the surface. The final, most audacious, most complex stage of the landing begins. The backshell, the upper part of the capsule with the parachute still attached, is cut away. Explosive bolts fire. For a terrifying, brief second, the rover and its jetpack are in total freefall. There is nothing holding them. Then, 8 powerful rocket engines on the descent stage, the sky crane, ignite simultaneously. They roar to life, instantly arresting the fall. The rover is now a living, breathing machine. It is flying under its own power, a jetpack slowing its descent, its brain fully in command. The roar of the rockets is deafening, kicking up a cloud of dust from the surface far below. The sky crane's first job is to kill the horizontal velocity. The parachute was drifting, and the sky crane inherited that sideways motion. The rover uses its radar and internal sensors to feel this drift, and it commands the thrusters to fire asymmetrically. It actively steers itself, canceling out the lateral movement until its descent is perfectly, vertically, straight down. Now, the TRN system, which had been patiently holding on to its new target, takes full control. Divert, the computer commands. The sky crane's thrusters gimbal, and the entire 1-ton machine slides sideways through the thin air. It is flying, actively, autonomously, diverting from the hazardous dunes it was destined for, and making a direct, powered approach to the safe haven it selected just seconds before. This is the moment, the billion-dollar upgrade, the act of robotic self-preservation. The rover is now just 70 feet above the ground. The rockets on the sky crane are firing at full throttle, kicking up a maelstrom of dust and pebbles. This dust cloud is a threat. If the rockets got any closer to the ground, they could blast the rover with high-velocity debris, sandblasting its delicate cameras and instruments. Or worse, the landing radar could be confused by the cloud, misjudging the altitude. This is why the sky crane was invented. The descent stage stops. It enters a stable, powered hover, holding its position perfectly against the Martian gravity. It has done its job. It has flown the rover to a safe location. Now, it must deliver the payload. The computer issues the final command. 3 more pyrotechnic charges fire, releasing blades that sever the umbilicals. 3 nylon tethers, each 21 feet long, spool out from the descent stage. The rover, Perseverance, is lowered, dangling beneath its jetpack, descending the final 70 feet at a slow, gentle 1.7 miles per hour. It is being lowered like a precious, delicate chandelier, past the cloud of dust and debris, toward the ancient lakebed of Jezero. The rover's 6-legged landing gear unfolds, locking into place. Its wheels, which have not touched the surface since they were built on Earth, reach down. The moment is here. The computer is waiting for a single, simple signal. The tethers go slack. A sensor in the rover feels its own weight settle. The wheels have made contact. It is on the ground. Instantly, in a fraction of a millisecond, the rover's computer recognizes the touchdown. It is a cascade of automated logic, a chain of commands that cannot be stopped. The rover must free itself, and it must do so immediately. It sends a final, critical signal up the tethers to the sky crane still hovering above it. The message is simple: I am safe. The sky crane, its one and only purpose in the universe now fulfilled, receives this message. Its onboard computer, which has been in perfect synchronization with the rovers, now executes its final, suicidal protocol. It fires the pyrotechnic charges at the base of the tethers. The 3 nylon bridles are severed. The connection is broken. The rover is alone on the surface, but the sky crane is still above it, rockets blazing. If it simply shut down, it would fall directly onto the multi-billion-dollar rover it had just so carefully delivered. It must dispose of itself. The sky crane's computer commands its engines to full throttle, but this time, it angles them. It pitches itself hard and fast, away from the landing site, away from the rover. It becomes a small, autonomous missile, accelerating rapidly, flying on its last fumes of fuel. It soars up and away, finally crashing into the Martian soil, a safe, planned 450 meters distant. A silent, violent end to a magnificent, purpose-built machine. On the surface, there is only dust. The cloud kicked up by the rockets is immense, a swirling fog of red particles that envelops the rover. Perseverance sits in this cloud, unmoving. The 7 minutes are over. The violence has passed. There is no fire, no plasma, no G-forces, no rocket engines. There is only the thin, cold wind of Mars and the gentle whir of the rover's internal electronics. Back at JPL, 11 minutes and 22 seconds after this moment, the control room is a tomb of silent tension. They are waiting for the signal. The flight director, Swati Mohan, her voice steady but laced with unimaginable pressure, calls out the events as the delayed data streams in. Her console is receiving the signals from the sky crane phase. Terrain relative navigation divert initiated, she reports. The engineers nod. The brain is flying. Tether cut signal detected. A few sharp intakes of breath. The rover has commanded the sky crane to fly away. This means it must be on the ground. But is it safe? Is it upright? Is it broken? They don't know. They are still minutes behind reality. They are waiting for the final, definitive proof. Not a signal from the descent stage, which is now debris, but a signal from the rover itself. A signal that can only be sent by a machine that is alive, on the surface, and in possession of its faculties. The data has to travel 127 million miles, be caught by the Deep Space Network, and be relayed to JPL. The silence in the room stretches, becoming unbearable. Then, a voice breaks the quiet. We have a signal from the MRO. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, flying overhead, had been acting as a relay. It caught the first UHF heartbeat from the rover. A new voice calls out, UHF X-band lock. We've got it. And then, the call everyone has waited a decade to hear. Swati Mohan, her voice breaking the tension, announces, touchdown confirmed! Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars, ready to begin seeking the signs of past life. The room explodes. A wave of thunderous applause, cheers and tears of relief washes over the engineers. People leap from their chairs, arms in the air. The years of anxiety, the sleepless nights, the failed parachute tests, the complex code. All of it dissolves in a single, shared moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. They did not land the rover. The rover landed itself. They had merely been the first to hear the news. But the machine on Mars is not celebrating. It is working. It has a post-landing checklist. It is running diagnostics. Its computer is assessing the health of every system, every instrument, every joint. It is stabilizing its power systems, checking its communication antenna, and preparing for its first day of work. And it is doing one more thing. During the entire descent, from the moment the heat shield was jettisoned, multiple cameras were rolling. For the first time in history, a Mars landing was not just a stream of data, it was a film production. A small camera on the back shell looked up, watching the parachute unfurl. A camera on the rover's belly looked down, watching the ground rush up. A camera on the sky crane looked down at the rover as it was being lowered. And a camera on the rover looked up at the sky crane. This was an engineering decision, designed to give the team a complete picture of the landing, to see what worked and what didn't. But its effect was profoundly human. Days later, when that footage was finally relayed back to Earth, it stunned the world. It was not an animation. It was not a simulation. It was real. The video shows the horrifying, beautiful moment of the parachute's supersonic inflation, a violent snap of orange and white against the pale Martian sky. It shows the heat shield dropping away, tumbling and glinting in the alien sunlight. It shows the ground, red and dusty, getting closer and closer, the terrain relative navigation system visibly hunting for its target. And then, the most spectacular shot of all. The view from the sky crane looking down. You see the 1-ton rover, Perseverance, dangling on its tethers. You see its wheels unfold, snapping into place. You see the thrusters firing, controlling the descent. And then, you see the dust appear. A cloud of red powder kicks up as the rover's wheels make contact. The tethers are cut. The rover is stationary. And the camera, on the sky crane, flies up and away, pitching over, showing the horizon as it speeds to its planned impact. It was a perspective humans had only ever dreamed of. It was the footage of an alien world, captured by an autonomous robot, during the most complex landing ever attempted. It was raw, unfiltered, and utterly magnificent. It was not just a technical confirmation, it was an emotional one. It made the landing real. Perseverance did not wait long to share its new home. Almost immediately after landing, its front and rear hazard cameras, the AWS cams, which were protected by clear covers, took their first images of the surface. The covers were still on, and the images were clouded by the dust of the landing, but they showed exactly what the engineers had prayed for: a flat, safe surface, and the shadow of the rover itself, cast long in the late afternoon Martian sun. These first black and white images were the true confirmation. They were the first postcards from Jezero Crater. They proved the rover was upright, intact, and operational. When they flashed up on the screens at JPL, a new wave of applause erupted. The rover was no longer just a data point. It was a presence. It was there. The location was perfect. The TRN system had performed flawlessly. It had seen the dangerous dunes of Saita and steered the rover 200 meters away to a patch of ground that was perfectly flat, drivable, and safe. It was the ultimate vindication of the autonomous brain. The gamble had paid off. In the days that followed, the rover began its commissioning phase, a slow, methodical awakening. Engineers on Earth sent commands to test its high-gain antenna, unfurl its mast, and power up its science instruments. The rover, now under human control, raised its head, the remote sensing mast, or RSM. At the top sat Mastcam Z, a pair of high-definition, zoomable cameras that would serve as the rover's main eyes. Its first task was to take a panoramic photograph of its surroundings. The result was breathtaking. The landing site, which they named Octavia E. Butler Landing after the visionary science fiction author, was a vast, wind-swept plain. But in the distance, visible and tantalizing, was the target, the delta. The layered sedimentary cliffs of the ancient river delta that held the very secrets Perseverance had crossed the solar system to find. The rover systems all checked out. Its power source, the multi-mission radioisotope thermoelectric generator, a small nuclear battery, was humming, providing ample electricity and warmth. Its computers were healthy. Its instruments were eager. But before the fossil hunter could begin its hunt, it had one more job to do. A technology demonstration that was, in its own way, as audacious as the landing itself. Tucked away on the rover's belly, a passenger had hitched a ride. A small, 4-pound, 4-legged experiment named Ingenuity. It was a helicopter. A machine whose entire purpose was to answer a simple, profound question: can we fly on another world? The Martian atmosphere is perilously thin. At the surface, its pressure is less than 1% of Earth's. Flying in this atmosphere is the equivalent of flying at an altitude of 100,000 feet on Earth. No helicopter had ever flown that high. To achieve lift, Ingenuity's two 4-foot-long, carbon fiber blades had to be impossibly light, yet spin in opposite directions at an incredible 2,400 revolutions per minute. It was an experiment, a Wright brothers moment that many believed was impossible. Perseverance drove a short distance away to a flat, clear area, which the team designated as the airfield. It carefully lowered Ingenuity from its belly, dropping it the last few inches to the ground. Then, it backed away, leaving the tiny helicopter alone on the surface. For the first time, Ingenuity had to survive the frigid Martian night on its own, using its own solar panel and internal heater. On April 19, 2021, the command was sent. Ingenuity's blades spun up, a high-pitched whine in the thin air. It pushed against the ground, and it lifted. It rose 10 feet into the air, hovered for 30 seconds, rotated, and then set back down, landing perfectly on the dust. Perseverance, parked at a safe distance, acted as the proud parent, filming the entire event with its Mastcam Z. The black and white footage of that first flight was historic. A small, spindly machine, a speck lifting off the ground, its own shadow dancing beneath it. It was the first powered, controlled flight on another planet. The 7 minutes of terror had delivered the mission. And that mission's first act was to defy gravity itself. With the helicopter's flight path proven, Perseverance's true mission could begin. The rover was now free to be what it was built to be: a robotic geologist, a time-traveling fossil hunter. Its primary target, the Great Delta, was still miles away. The science team decided to first investigate the crater floor itself, the ground they had landed on. This was a place they had only seen from orbit, and it held its own immediate mysteries. The rover's head is a masterpiece of sensory equipment. The Mastcam Z cameras, with their powerful zoom, became the team's eyes, scouting the path ahead, identifying rocks of interest. But Perseverance can do more than just see. It can hear and analyze from a distance. A sophisticated instrument called SuperCam, mounted on the mast, fires a high-powered laser at a target up to 20 feet away. The laser vaporizes a pinhead-sized amount of rock, creating a tiny, bright spark of plasma. SuperCam's telescope then analyzes the color of that light. Every element, whether it's iron, magnesium, or silicon, burns with a unique spectral signature. From this single flash of light, the rover can determine the rock's precise chemical composition. It also carries a microphone, the first to ever record the sound of Mars. It captured the thin, eerie whine of the wind, the crunch of its own wheels on the gravel, and the sharp snap of its own laser, a sound that gives scientists clues about the rock's hardness. Perseverance began its slow, methodical trek across the crater floor. Its 6 wheels, an upgraded aluminum design, were built to be tougher than Curiosity's, which had been famously torn up by sharp rocks. Each wheel had its own independent motor, and the rover's autonomous navigation, a system called AutoNav, allowed it to drive itself for long stretches. The engineers on Earth would simply point to a destination on a map, and the rover's brain would use its own cameras to perceive the terrain, identify hazards, and plot the safest, most efficient path, all without human intervention. It was driving on what scientists had long assumed was sedimentary rock, the compressed mud and silt of the ancient lake bed. This is what you would expect to find at the bottom of a lake. But as SuperCam zapped the rocks, and as the rover extended its robotic arm for a closer look, the data told a completely different and far more exciting story. The robotic arm, a 7-foot-long marvel of engineering, is the rover's true science end. At its tip is a 90-pound turret of instruments. One of them, Pixel, uses X-rays to map the elemental composition of a rock, down to the scale of a grain of salt. Another, Sherlock, uses an ultraviolet laser and a camera named Watson to find organic molecules and minerals. This is the front line in the search for life. It is designed to find the specific chemical building blocks that life, as we know it, leaves behind. To use them, the rover first uses a small grinder on its arm, the abrader, to brush away millennia of red dust, exposing the clean gray interior of the rock. Then, over the course of many hours, it places Pixel and Sherlock against the target, scanning it meticulously. The results that came back from these first crater floor rocks were a shock. They weren't sedimentary. They were not lake mud. They were igneous. This was volcanic rock. The data showed clear, crystalline structures of minerals like olivine, a common volcanic mineral on Earth. This meant that the floor of Jezero Crater was not the bottom of a calm lake. It was the remains of a volcanic eruption, or a vast, slow-cooling body of magma that had pushed up from below. This was a profound discovery. It meant that the history of Jezero was not just one of water, but also one of fire. These igneous rocks provided a perfect geological clock. Using radioactive dating on Earth, scientists would be able to determine the exact age of this rock. And since the water that formed the delta flowed over this volcanic floor, it would, for the first time, allow them to pin an absolute date on when water last flowed in Jezero Crater. They were not just finding a story, they were finding its timeline. Now, the rover had to do its most important job, the one that defines the entire mission. It had to collect a sample. This is the rover's climax. Perseverance is not just a laboratory, it is a courier. Its core purpose is to drill into these rocks, extract a finger-sized core, and seal it in an ultra-clean titanium tube. This tube, one of 43 carried on board, would then be dropped on the surface to be collected by a future, complex Mars sample return mission and brought back to Earth. This process is the single most complex robotic system ever sent to another world. Inside the rover chassis is a second, hidden robotic arm, 1.6 foot long, sample-handling arm, living in a sterile, pristine white chamber. The entire sampling process involves 11 different motors, 3,000 individual parts, and a precise 11-day ballet of robotic movement. First, the large external robotic arm drills into the rock using a hollow coring bit. The drill is rotary percussive, meaning it both spins and hammers, a necessity for hard volcanic rock. After it drills the core, it pulls back. A small internal mechanism pushes the sample tube, gleaming and sterile, into the bit. The bit is then retracted fully into the rover's body, through a port, and into the internal clean room. This is where the little arm takes over. It grabs the filled sample tube from the drill. It carries it to a volume assessment station, where a probe measures the amount of rock captured. Then, it moves it to a sealing station, where a powerful mechanism presses a hermetic, contamination-proof cap onto the tube. This seal is critical. It must preserve the sample, trapping any potential ancient Martian microbes, or the chemical traces of them, in a pristine state, protecting them from the modern Martian environment and any earthly contamination. Finally, the small arm places the sealed, now priceless tube into a storage carousel. It is a factory, a bottling plant, and a vault, all miniaturized and packed into the belly of a nuclear-powered rover. On August 6, 2021, the team was ready. They had found the perfect rock, a flat, promising piece of volcanic pavement. They sent the commands. The rover's arm extended. The drill spun up. It hammered into the rock. The data streamed back to Earth. The drill cycle was perfect. The rover reported that the tube had been processed and sealed. The team at JPL celebrated. They had just collected their first sample of Mars. But when the rover took a picture of the drill bit before it transferred the tube, the team's celebration turned to confusion, and then to dread. The tube, which should have been full of gray rock core, was empty. The drill had worked. The sample tube had been processed. But the rock itself had vanished. The team was baffled. Had the sample crumbled? Had it fallen out? They commanded the rover to take a picture of the borehole it had just drilled. The image showed a perfect, neat hole. But the ground around it was clear. The rock hadn't shattered into powder. It seemed that the rock core, after being drilled, had simply not entered the tube. It had likely been a rock too brittle to hold together, and it had been pulverized and lost. This was a critical, early mission failure. The $2.7 billion rover had failed its single most important task. The team on Earth spent weeks diagnosing the problem, recreating the event in their test bed, drilling every type of rock they could find. They concluded it was not a failure of the rover, but a failure of the rock. It was simply not a good candidate. They had to find something tougher. They drove to a new location, a ridgeline with rocks that looked more robust. They found a target, a briefcase-sized rock they named Rochette. They were nervous. If this failed, it could mean a fundamental flaw in the entire sampling system. On September 1, 2021, they tried again. The drill whirred. The arm moved. The data came back. This time, before sealing the tube, they commanded the rover to take a picture inside the tube. The image that came back to JPL was hailed with as much, if not more, celebration than the landing itself. There, illuminated by the rover's internal lights, was a perfect, pencil-thick core of grayish-green Martian rock. It was there. It was solid. It was captured. The rover then proceeded to seal the tube, proving the entire chain, from drilling to sealing to storing, was a success. They had their first piece of Mars. The core of the mission was validated. They had a piece of the ancient volcanic floor, a rock that would one day tell them the absolute age of Jezero Crater. The hunt was on. Perseverance then drilled a second, twin sample from the same rock. This is the mission's core strategy. For every target, it collects two samples. One is stored in the rover's belly as a primary set. The other will eventually be dropped on the surface in a depot, a cache of tubes that will be the target for the sample return lander. This redundancy ensures that even if something happens to the rover, the priceless collection is not lost. Having conquered the crater floor and proven its systems, it was now time. Time to go to the place they had traveled 300 million miles to see. The rover turned its wheels northwest and began the long, historic drive toward the great, dried, ancient river delta. This was the place where water, billions of years ago, had flowed into the lake. If there was ever life in Jezero, its chemical and physical remains would be most concentrated there, in the fine-grained sedimentary layers of mud and clay that the river had deposited, one layer at a time, season after season, millennium after millennium. The rover was driving toward the most promising astrobiological target ever visited by humanity. The long traverse began. This was not a sprint, it was a marathon, executed at a deliberate robotic pace. The rover's top speed on flat, hard ground is just over 0.1 miles per hour. But its true strength was not speed, it was persistence. The mission entered a new phase, one defined by driving. Days, then weeks, then months were spent on this grand trek, a 3-mile journey that would take the rover to an entirely new geological province. And it was driving, for the most part, by itself. The autonav system, the autonomous brain that had landed the rover, was now its full-time chauffeur. Engineers on Earth, working on Mars time, would review 3D maps of the terrain ahead. They wouldn't tell the rover, turn 15 degrees, move forward 10 meters, stop. They would simply draw a large polygon on the map, hundreds of meters away, and say, go here. Perseverance would then wake up, and for hours at a time, take complete control. Its stereo navigation cameras would build a constant real-time 3D model of the terrain in front of it, identifying every rock, every slope, every patch of dangerous sand. It would plot its own course through the hazards, its wheels turning, its brain constantly reassessing. That rock is too tall, I will go left. That slope is too steep, I will find a flatter path. This sand is too soft, I will go around. It was a display of robotic independence that was happening every single day, 300 million miles from its creators. But it was not alone. Its small companion, Ingenuity, was proving to be one of the most successful experiments in NASA history. Its 30-day, 5-flight mission was extended indefinitely. It was no longer a tech demo. It was a full-fledged member of the science team. It became the rover's scout, its eye in the sky. Before Perseverance would begin a long, complex drive, Ingenuity would fly. It would leap into the thin Martian air, soaring ahead, its small color camera mapping the route. It flew over treacherous dune fields that the rover would have to painstakingly navigate around. It scouted paths through rock-strewn plains, identifying the safest and most efficient path for its 1-ton partner. It would send this data back to the rover's human planners, giving them a bird's-eye view that they had never had before. This two-robot team, a ground-based laboratory and an aerial scout, was a new paradigm for planetary exploration. The little helicopter saved the rover weeks, possibly months of difficult driving. The rover's path was a long, sweeping arc. It had to navigate around the most hazardous part of the crater floor, the Saita region. This was the very field of sand dunes and jagged rocks that the terrain relative navigation system had so brilliantly diverted the rover away from during the landing. Now, driving along its edge, the team could see with their own eyes that the landing system's decision was correct. Saita was a death trap, a place the rover would likely have been stuck in forever. The 7 minutes of terror had not just been about success, it had been about precision. After nearly a year of driving, scouting, and sampling the crater floor, Perseverance finally arrived. In early 2022, it rode up to the base of the delta. The feature that had been a distant, hazy mesa on the horizon was now a towering, 130-foot-tall wall of rock. It was a stunning, alien landscape, a Martian Badlands. The rover had arrived at a location the science team had named Three Forks, the point where the ancient river channel once split, depositing its sediments into the lake. The geology changed instantly and dramatically. The dark, crystalline volcanic rock of the crater floor gave way to light-colored, fine-grained, layered rock. This was it. This was the sedimentary rock the mission had been designed to find. The rover was no longer on a magma plain, it was on a beach. It was parked at the edge of an ancient, dried-out, 3-billion-year-old mudflat. The science team was ecstatic. These layers were a history book. Each horizontal line in the cliff face represented a different period, a different set of conditions in the ancient lake. A thick layer of coarse sandstone might represent a powerful seasonal flood. A thin layer of delicate, fine-grained mudstone might represent a calm, dry period where silt gently settled to the lake bottom. The entire story of Jezero's watery past was written in this wall, and Perseverance had a front-row seat. But this new environment presented a new, immense challenge. The rover was a vehicle. The delta was a mountain. The most interesting and oldest layers were at the bottom, but the youngest and most diverse layers were at the top. To read the whole book, Perseverance couldn't just stay at the base. It had to climb. The team on Earth began a new kind of scouting. They used the rover's Mastcam Z, zooming in on every detail of the Delta front. They used ingenuity, sending it on complex flights to map the cliffs, not looking for a path through hazards, but for a path up them. They were no longer just scientists. They were robotic mountaineers, searching for a safe on-ramp that could take their 1-ton rover up the face of a 130-foot cliff. They found a potential route, a winding, sloping valley, a natural ramp that seemed to cut up the side of the delta. This would be the path. But before the great climb began, the rover had work to do at the base. It approached a rock at the very bottom of the delta, a slab of fine-grained mudstone. This rock was, in all likelihood, formed from the tiniest particles of silt and clay that had been suspended in the lake, slowly settling in the deep, calm water. If microbial life had ever existed in that lake, this is where its remains would be. When the microbes died, they would have settled to the bottom, becoming part of this mud. This rock was a prime astrobiological target. The rover's arm extended. The abrader whirred, brushing away the red dust. The drill spun, and it took its first sample of the delta. When the Sherlock instrument scanned this new rock, the data it sent back to Earth was electrifying. It found the highest concentration of complex organic molecules ever seen on Mars. This was a discovery that had to be handled with extreme care. Organic molecules does not mean life. These are not fossils. These are the building blocks for life, molecules rich in carbon and hydrogen. They can be created by purely geological processes without any life at all. But finding them here, in this specific type of rock, a sedimentary mudstone, formed in a habitable, watery environment, was the single most promising discovery in the history of astrobiology. It proved two things at once. First, that the ingredients for life were present in the waters of Lake Jezero 3 billion years ago. And second, and perhaps more importantly, it proved that this type of rock is capable of preserving those molecules, of protecting them from the harsh radiation and chemistry of the Martian surface for billions of years. The rover had found the right environment. It had found the right rocks, and it had found the chemical building blocks. It had found the smoke. Now, it had to continue the hunt for the fire. It had to see if this pattern continued. It had to see what else was hidden in these layers. The rover stored its precious sample of organic-bearing mudstone and turned its wheels toward the ramp. The climb was about to begin. Based on our progress, we are at approximately 7,850 words. This next, final part will complete the narrative arc, taking the rover up the delta, detailing its most profound discoveries, and reflecting on the legacy of the mission. This part will bring the total word count to just over 8,900 words, fulfilling the 8,000-word minimum. Only one part remains after this one. Here is the text-only narration for Part 6. The rover, now a seasoned veteran of the Martian surface, began its most arduous journey, the climb. It was now a robotic mountaineer, ascending the 130-foot-tall face of the delta. This was not a gentle, pre-paved path. It was a rugged, winding trail of broken rock and steep, sandy slopes. The auto-nav system was pushed to its absolute limits. The rover's brain, which had so expertly landed it, was now meticulously planning every single wheel turn. It would stop, its mast turning, its cameras building a 3D map of the path ahead. It would analyze the tilt, the traction, the stability of the rocks. A high-centered chassis, a wheel trapped in soft sand, a slip on a steep slope. Any one of these would mean the end of the mission, a permanent billion-dollar monument to a single bad step. For weeks, it crept upward, executing a climb that no human controller, operating under an 11-minute delay, could have ever attempted. And as it climbed, it was literally traveling upward through time. The fine-grained mudstones at the base, where it found the organics, represented the calm, deep, ancient lake. But as it ascended, the layers changed. The rock became coarser. It found layers of sandstone, the kind of rock formed by a faster-moving, shallower river. It was reading the history book, chapter by chapter. Then, halfway up the delta, it found something that stunned the science team back on Earth. It found boulders, not small pebbles. It found large, rounded rocks, some several feet across, cemented into the very layers of the cliff face. This was a discovery that rewrote the story of Jezero. A calm, gentle lake cannot move boulders. A slow, meandering river cannot move boulders. Only one thing can: a powerful, high-energy churning flood, a torrent. The data was undeniable. Jezero was not always a placid, tranquil oasis. At times, it was a place of catastrophic, violent, and episodic floods. The river that fed it would, perhaps seasonally or perhaps during periods of rapid climate change, become a raging force, ripping up boulders from the highlands miles upstream and tumbling them into the crater. This painted a far more dynamic, complex, and Earth-like picture of ancient Mars, a world of dramatic change, of droughts and deluges. Perseverance, the diligent geologist, extended its arm. It zapped these new rocks with its laser. It abraded their surfaces, and it drilled. It took samples of this coarse-grained sandstone, of these flood deposits. The collection of tubes in its belly was no longer just a few interesting rocks. It was now a complete, cohesive story. A geological core that chronicled the entire history of this environment, from the fiery volcanic floor, to the calm, organic, rich lake muds, to the violent, boulder-moving river floods. It was the most comprehensive history of an alien world ever assembled. Having reached the top of the delta, a new, flat plain that was once the riverbed, the rover had fulfilled its primary science mission. It had found the story. Now it had to ensure that story could one day be read by humans. It was time to build the depot. Perseverance turned around, and with all the caution of its ascent, it drove back down the delta. It returned to the flat, open crater floor, to a spot near its landing site. The team had used its cameras to select a location that was, by design, perfectly boring. A 100-meter-long, pancake-flat stretch of ground, free of any rocks or slopes. They named it Three Forks. This would not be a landing site for a rover as smart as Perseverance. It would be a simple, safe runway for a future, much simpler, fetch mission. Then, the final, delicate ballet began. The rover's internal, pristine sample handling arm retrieved the first twin tube from its storage carousel. This tube was a perfect copy of the first volcanic rock core it had ever collected. The small arm passed the gleaming titanium cylinder to the large, external robotic arm. The external arm, which had drilled through rock and climbed mountains, now performed its most delicate operation. It lowered the tube until it was just inches from the red dust. And then, with a simple, quiet command, it opened its gripper. The tube dropped. It was a quiet, anticlimactic, and profoundly historic moment. A piece of Mars, carefully selected, cored and sealed, was now sitting on the surface, waiting. The rover backed up. It moved over 5 inches. It retrieved the next tube. It lowered its arm, and it dropped it. One by one, over the course of 2 months, Perseverance placed 10 tubes on the ground. It laid them out in a precise zigzag pattern, each one meticulously spaced, each one's location logged to the millimeter. This was the cache, the crown jewels of the mission. A collection of volcanic and sedimentary rocks, including the precious organic-bearing mudstone, all lying in the open, a message in a bottle cast onto the red desert. This single act, the creation of this depot, is the true, lasting legacy of the 7 minutes of terror. The impossible autonomous landing, the terrain relative navigation, the sky crane. It was all, in the end, for this. To give a machine the intelligence to land in a place of lethal danger, to find these specific rocks, to drill them, and to lay them on the ground. It is the first time humanity has ever staged a cache of samples on another world for retrieval. With the depot complete, Perseverance's primary mission was over. It had done everything it was sent to do. But it is not a machine built for retirement. Fueled by its nuclear battery, the rover is now in its extended mission. A bonus round. It is exploring again. Having left the cache behind, it is now climbing the crater rim itself, exploring rocks even older than the lake, adding more to its own onboard collection. Its small companion, Ingenuity, which was only supposed to fly 5 times, completed 72 historic flights, scouting for the rover for almost 3 years. Its mission finally ended in January 2024 when it made a hard landing, damaging its rotor blades. It was a stunning success, a pioneer to the very last, forever silent on the same airfield where it first took flight. But perseverance drives on, and the story is no longer just about the rover. It is about the future. Back on Earth, engineers at NASA and the European Space Agency are now finalizing the design of the machines that will go and retrieve that cache. A new lander will arrive. It will deploy a small, fast-fetch rover that will speed across the plane, find the zigzag of tubes, and pick them up. It will carry them back to the lander and place them in a small rocket. That rocket, the Mars Ascent Vehicle, will, for the first time, light its engines and launch from the surface of another world, carrying the samples into orbit. There, a third spacecraft, an orbiter, will autonomously rendezvous, capture the container, and begin the long, final journey back to Earth. The 7 minutes of terror, that agonizing, autonomous sequence of fire and logic, was just the beginning. The 11-minute light delay that caused so much anxiety for the landing team is now a permanent, quiet feature of the story. Because on Mars, in the silent dust of Jezero Crater, a message is once again waiting. Not a radio signal, but a physical one. A collection of 10 small titanium tubes that hold the 3-billion-year-old story of an ancient, watery world. A world that may or may not have been alive. The rover that had to land itself, the machine that had to see the danger and divert, has given us the one thing we could never get from orbit. It has given us ground truth. It has given us a chance to, one day, hold a piece of Mars in our own hands. A chance to answer the question. A chance to find a piece of ourselves, our own origin, in the red alien dust of another world.